Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs Story. In the midst of winter, when snowflakes were descending from the clouds like feathers, a queen sat by her palace window. The frame of the window was black like ebony, and she was sewing shirts for her husband while gazing at the snow. While doing so, she accidentally pricked her finger and 3 drops of blood fell on the white snow. The red drops appeared beautiful on the white snow, and the queen wished for a child with skin as white as snow, hair as black as ebony, and lips as red as blood. Soon after, she gave birth to a daughter who was named Snow White due to her appearance, white skin, red cheeks, and black hair. Unfortunately, the queen passed away during childbirth. Roughly a year later, the king got married to another woman who was very beautiful. But her pride and arrogance made her intolerant of anyone being more attractive than her. She possessed a magical mirror and would often ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most beautiful of them all?" The mirror would always answer, "You, my queen, are the most beautiful of all." This response pleased her greatly, and she believed it to be true. As Snow White grew up, she became more and more beautiful, and by the time she reached the age of 7, she was as beautiful as the shining sun and even more attractive than the queen herself. The queen, on the other hand, became insecure and repeatedly asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" The mirror responded with, "Yesterday the queen was the fairest, but now they say Snow White is the fairest of them all." This response caused the queen to become extremely envious and resentful towards Snow White. Her hatred for the young girl grew so strong that she could not stand to see her anymore. She instructed a huntsman to take Snow White to the forest and kill her, demanding her heart and tongue as proof. The huntsman agreed to do as she said, but when he took out his knife to execute her, Snow White pleaded with him, crying and promising to run away and never return if he spared her life. The huntsman was moved by Snow White's plea and her beauty, and he felt sorry for her. He said, "All right, go then, poor child." But he worried that she would not survive in the wild forest. Even so, he was relieved that he did not have to hurt her. Suddenly, a young boar appeared and started to charge towards them. The huntsman quickly killed the boar and took its heart and tongue as proof of Snow White's death. He brought them to the queen to show that he had completed the task she had given him. Snow White was now alone and without a mother. She was overwhelmed with sadness and confusion, not knowing which direction to take. She ran until she could no longer move her feet, and as it was getting dark, she stumbled upon a small, elegant cottage. Inside, everything was tidy and small. In the center of the room was a little table with 7 little plates, each with a spoon, knife, and fork, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall were 7 little beds lined up in a row, each with snow white sheets. Snow White was hungry and thirsty, so she ate a small amount of porridge from each plate and drank a drop of wine from each mug, so as not to take all of one person's share. Exhausted, she tried each of the 7 little beds. The first was uncomfortable. The second was too long. The fourth was too short, and the 5th was too hard. The 7th one was perfect, so she snuggled into it and said her prayers before falling asleep. As darkness fell, the owners of the cottage came home. They were 7 dwarfs who worked in the mountains searching for gold and silver. They lit 7 little lamps and noticed that someone had been in their home as things were not in the same order as they had left them. The first dwarf asked who had been sitting on his chair, the second asked who had been eating from his plate, and the third asked who had been nibbling at his bread. The fourth asked who had been eating his porridge, the 5th questioned who had been meddling with his fork, while the 6th complained about someone cutting with his knife. The 7th dwarf asked who had been drinking out of his mug. The first dwarf then noticed that someone had been lying on his bed as the sheets were messed up. The other dwarfs checked their beds and found that someone had been lying in each of them too. The seventh dwarf ran up to his bed and found Snow White sleeping in it. He called the other dwarves, who were amazed and held up their lamps to see the little girl. The dwarves were amazed by Snow White's beauty and did not want to disturb her sleep. The dwarf whose bed she was sleeping in shared his bed with each of his companions for an hour each throughout the night. The next morning, Snow White woke up and was frightened to see the 7 dwarfs. However, they were friendly and asked her name and why she had come to their cottage. Snow White told them about how her stepmother wanted to kill her, but she had escaped and wandered around until she found their home. The dwarves then asked if she would stay with them and take care of their household tasks, such as cooking, cleaning, and sewing. They promised to provide for her and keep her safe from harm. Snow White agreed to their proposal and stayed with them. During the day, while the dwarves worked in the mountains, Snow White was left alone, and they warned her to be careful of her stepmother, who might try to find her and harm her. They instructed her not to let anyone into the cottage. The queen thought that she had consumed Snow White's heart and tongue, and as a result, she considered herself the most beautiful woman in the world. One day, she stood in front of her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" The mirror responded, "The queen was the fairest yesterday. Snow White is fairest now," they say. "The dwarfs protect her from thy sway amid the forest, far away." Upon hearing that Snow White was still alive, the queen became furious, and her blood rushed to her heart. She decided to create something that would completely destroy Snow White, saying to herself, "But now will I make something which shall destroy her completely." She used her knowledge of dark arts to make a poisoned comb and disguised herself as an old widow. She then traveled to the home of the 7 dwarves, located over 7 hills, and knocked on the door, calling out, "Good wares to sell today." Snow White peeked out and refused to let her in. However, the old woman convinced her to look at the poisoned comb by holding it up and saying, "But still, you may look." Snow White was pleased and allowed the old woman to enter after buying something. The old woman then asked to comb her hair properly, and Snow White agreed. But as soon as the comb touched her hair, the poison began to work, and Snow White fell unconscious. The wicked queen exclaimed, "You pattern of beauty, it is now all over with you," and left Snow White lying on the ground as if dead. Fortunately, the 7 dwarves returned in the evening and suspected the queen when they saw Snow White unconscious with a poisoned comb. They removed the comb, and Snow White soon revived and told them what had happened. They warned her again and told her not to open the door to anyone. Meanwhile, the queen went home and consulted her mirror, receiving the same answer as before, which made her furious. She swore to kill Snow White, even if it cost her own life. She then made a poisoned apple, disguised herself as a peasant's wife, and traveled to the 7 dwarves' house. Snow White refused to let her in, but the old woman insisted and offered her an apple. Snow White refused to take the apple, but the old woman insisted and offered to cut it in half, with Snow White eating the red cheeks and the old woman eating the core, which was the only part that was poisoned. Snow White wanted the beautiful apple so much that she couldn't resist and took the poison part. Immediately after eating it, she fell down dead on the ground. The queen looked at her with glittering eyes and laughed bitterly, saying, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time the dwarves cannot reawaken you." When the queen returned home and asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" And the mirror responded, "The queen is fairest of the day." So her envious heart was at peace. When the dwarves returned home, they found Snow White lying on the ground, and she appeared to be dead. They tried to find anything poisonous, unlaced her, uncombed her hair, and washed her with water and wine, but nothing worked. They placed her on a bier, and all 7 of them wept for 3 days without stopping. They decided to bury her, but she still looked lifelike, and her red cheeks had not faded. They didn't want to bury her in the ground, so they had a glass case made for her. They wrote her name with golden letters on the glass, stating that she was a king's daughter. They placed the glass case on a rock ledge and always had one of them watching over it. Even the birds mourned the loss of Snow White. An owl, a raven, and a dove all came to express their sorrow. Snow White remained peacefully in her glass case for a long time, looking as if she were only sleeping, still white as snow, red as blood, and black-haired as ebony. One day, a king's son was traveling in the forest and came across the dwarf's house. He saw the glass case with the beautiful maiden inside and read the golden inscription. He asked the dwarves to sell it to him, but they refused. The prince pleaded with them, saying he couldn't live without Snow White, and he would honor and protect her. Eventually, the dwarves pitied him and gave him the case. As the prince's attendants were carrying it away, they stumbled and dislodged a piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's mouth. She woke up and asked where she was, and the prince told her everything that had happened and asked her to be his wife. Snow White agreed, and they got married with great splendor and magnificence at the castle of the king, his father. Snow White's stepmother received an invitation to the wedding, and when she was dressed up, she went in front of her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of us all?" The mirror replied, "The queen was fairest yesterday. The prince's bride is now," they say. The queen was furious and mortified by these words and didn't know what to do with herself. At first, she decided not to attend the wedding, but her desire to see the princess was too strong. When she saw the bride, she realized that it was Snow White and was so shocked and enraged that she ran out of the castle and was never seen again.